Welcome back to Real Takes, where we are all movie love all the time. I'm Ann Stott, and tonight we'll start the way we always do by highlighting an organization I care about that I hope you'll support. Tonight I want to talk about the Museum of the Moving Image based in New York City, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's a museum archiving and chronicling the history of film and television. And I'm talking about this tonight in particular because one of the films we're going to talk about is not available to stream anywhere. And there's so many great films that aren't available to stream anywhere. And if you don't own a DVD player, which I've been telling you to do, buy a DVD player. They're not that expensive. You can't watch some of the films I've talked about. So the Museum of the Moving Image is a really important organization preserving the history of film and television, which needs to happen in a nonprofit way since so many decisions about what films get preserved and what films get transferred to new platforms, etc., is financial. We need nonprofit organizations making decisions about how to preserve films and television that is culturally important, even if it's not necessarily financially advantageous for anyone. I will link to them below. Tonight we are talking about Libra film artist Tim Robbins, film and theater artist, I should say, Tim Robbins. And in particular, we're talking about two films from 1992, the Robert Altman film, The Player, which he starred in, and then the film Bob Roberts, which he wrote, directed, and starred in. So, and it's very interesting that these two films happened in the same year. For me, it's very interesting because I know that Robert Altman had been very important to Tim Robbins before starting to work with him. And then he was cast as the lead in this movie, The Player, which is a satire about the cutthroat culture of Hollywood. And Tim Robbins plays a Hollywood executive who knows how to be a player and end up on top, regardless of what it does to anybody else. And this movie came out in the same year, like I said, as his film Bob Roberts, which is a political satire about a certain kind of conservative candidate. And so to have these two roles appear from him in the same year is interesting and kind of solidified his reputation as having a special talent at playing bad guys. Tim Robbins grew up in Greenwich Village. His father was a folk musician who ran the Gaslight Cafe, and Tim Robbins was steeped in folk music and the downtown culture of the 60s and 70s. Then he got into acting, and like I said, has been a committed theater artist his whole life as well. He I believe was a founding member of the Actors Gang, which is a working theater company that produces theater and also brings theater to prisons in the California prison system. So that's work he's been doing his whole life. But he also obviously has had a huge, decades-long film career, which skyrocketed to new levels in the 80s when he was cast as the love triangle, Bull Durham with Susan Sarandon and Kevin Costner. And then from there had a whole series of very successful roles, including starring in The Player, Robert Altman's film. So I really want to get into Bob Roberts because, again, we're celebrating Libras. It's the time of Libra, and it's no mistake that we're talking about two faux documentaries this month. We already talked about the Wherein I, created by Carrie Brownstein and Annie Clark / St. Vincent. And now we're talking about Bob Roberts, which is calls on the mockumentary style, although I wouldn't call it quite a mockumentary. So Bob Roberts is a movie about a British documentary team making a documentary about a conservative political candidate running for senator in Pennsylvania in the early 1990s, who was also a folk musician and a very successful businessman. Now, Tim Robbins has said that this, like in one interview, he sort of said it's a cross between The Candidate and This Is Spinal Tap. So The Candidate is a movie from the early 70s starring Robert Redford about someone who's a left-leaning political activist who decides to run for office as a way to get his voice out there and sort of get sucked into the whole political machine, the sort of fame political machine, and gets corrupted by it. This Is Spinal Tap is the famous mockumentary directed by Rob Reiner, but written by Christopher Guest, which would spark a whole career of mockumentaries, including Waiting for Guffman and Best in Show and many others. But This Is Spinal Tap in particular is about a hard rock band. He has also said that it's a cross between D.A. Pennebaker's Don't Look Back and This Is Spinal Tap. Now, we talked about Don't Look Back many films ago in the Real Take series. It's one of my favorite concert documentaries. It's D.A. Pennebaker's documentary about Bob Dylan's British tour as he was becoming the folk rock icon that we now know that he is. And it was a moment where Pennebaker was able to use a new kind of film camera that allowed him to be kind of inside the action and much more nimble and agile with the camera than even documentaries had been before that. So it's this very exciting experience where Dylan the artist is becoming sort of coming into his full powers of what he had to offer as an artist, and documentary is shifting as the film is being made. This is a really exciting documentary. And yes, he's mean to Joan Baez, and no, I don't like that, but I still love that film and I still love Bob Dylan, so deal with that. I get flack about that sometimes, so I'm just putting it out there. But what's interesting to me is that in the interviews that I have found about Bob Roberts, Tim Robbins never talks about the film Nashville, which was the film that kind of solidified Robert Altman's style as a filmmaker. And Nashville is a film about a British documentary film crew making a documentary about Nashville. So I had to jump in because I got so curious about this that I actually started watching Nashville again, and I was wrong. So I've come to say I was wrong. So Nashville is a film about the city of Nashville and kind of a look at the sparkling surface of the country music capital of the world. And then as the film goes on, we kind of see beneath the surface. And there is a British documentary maker who's a character in the film, but we are not seeing the film through her perspective. She's just one of the ensemble, and her presence does give us a kind of perspective and a window that we wouldn't have otherwise, but we're not in her perspective. And part of what's so visceral and powerful about Bob Roberts is that it is shot as a documentary film from the start. There's no outside perspective on the documentary experience. And Tim Robbins has actually talked about how careful they were and how true they were to the rules of documentary filmmaking. And there were only a couple of times when they kind of stretched what would happen in a documentary and used, slight narrative filmmaking techniques just because they needed to for storytelling. But there's a lot of handheld camera. There's a lot of following the action, following people where they're going. There's some fantastic long shots of action unfolding in a sort of cinema verite style. And so we are brought into the world of discovering, and the way it's made, the camera doesn't know what's going to happen before we do, and it makes it really exciting and present. And I actually think, because it had been a while since I'd seen Nashville, that I sort of, because of Bob Roberts, like projected back onto Nashville a more immediate cinematic style than it actually has. And I mean, Nashville's, you know, a landmark in American cinema that, you know, I highly recommend everyone see, but it is not as visceral as Bob Roberts is. So yeah, I got it wrong. And that's why Tim Robbins doesn't talk about Nashville as a cinematic influence. You know, I've heard Tim Robbins talk about how important Robert Altman is to him, and in fact, how important Nashville is to him. And I do feel Altman's influence in the film in a more subtle way, in terms of what we see and what we don't see, and like courageous choices about subtlety and how little is directly told about this very sinister character, and yet it becomes perfectly clear who he is. And I feel some Altman in that. Would love to hear Tim Robbins talk about that sometime. But back to our regularly scheduled program. Now, it's a much more focused story than Nashville is. We have a central character who is this conservative, folk singing, successful businessman running for Senate in Pennsylvania. And through this documentary lens, we kind of see the surface of who he is, and then there are these moments where we're flashed into who he really is. And there's so many great elements to this film. First of all, Tim Robbins got a lot of his friends to play local news anchors and reporters. So James Spader, Susan Sarandon, Helen Hunt, like so many others played news anchors. And he said in one interview that, you know, in every city there are these local news anchors, and they're beautiful, and they sort of could be movie stars, but they're news anchors, and they don't necessarily know that much about the news. I'm extrapolating a little here. That was never exactly what Tim Robbins said. And so to him, it made perfect sense to take these people who are actually huge movie stars and have them play news anchors. The great late Alan Rickman plays the campaign manager or political mastermind behind the campaign of Bob Roberts. And actually, Tim Robbins has said that Alan Rickman is really responsible for the film being made. So Tim Robbins had the idea for this character years before he made this film. And originally the character was just going to be an entertainer and a businessman. And he actually pitched the idea to Saturday Night Live, and they gave him money to make a little short film about this character who at that point was just a businessman and an entertainer. And that went well, and then the character kept sort of living on, and Tim Robbins has said, like, as the ambition of the 80s grew, so did Bob Roberts' ambitions grow, and he turned into a politician. And, you know, Tim Robbins ended up writing this script, and because he has a music background and his brother is a musician, he and his brother wrote all these conservative folk songs for the character, and they had the script. And then they started pitching it, but of course it was really hard to get money for it because production companies didn't want to make this scathing political satire. But finally, they got the money for it, and they were in pre-production. They were just a couple weeks out from when they were supposed to start shooting, and they got a call from one of the financiers saying, you need another big movie star or we're pulling our money. And even though he had these huge movie stars playing the news anchors and other sort of cameos and small roles, they said that's not enough. We need a bigger star in a bigger role. And Tim Robbins had met Alan Rickman, and he called him up and he asked him to play this part. And he didn't say the movie won't happen if you don't say yes, but he said, we really need you. We'd love to have you. He sent him the script. Alan Rickman loved the script and said yes and came on board. And so the film went ahead with its production. So the great Alan Rickman, always love seeing him on camera. And he plays a wonderfully nefarious character who's seems like a conglomeration of kind of several 80s stereotypes in politics and dirty dealings in general. The great Giancarlo Esposito plays a lefty journalist who is sort of so deep in his story you kind of don't know if he's grounded in reality or not, but he's uncovering disturbing truths. And just a whole great big ensemble cast. But the thing that's so scary about this movie is how right Tim Robbins got so many things. So, a lot of film buffs talked about this movie in 2016 during the Trump campaign and then after Trump was elected. And anyone who's followed politics for the last 30 years can tell you that, Trump is a manifestation of the worst of what Reagan began in the early 80s with, the deregulation of media and, the total privileging of wealth and capitalism over community and caring for each other. But the Bob Roberts character seemed somewhat extreme at the time. And then, of course, Trump has taken it so much further. I mean, at least the Bob Roberts character had a talent. He could sing and play a guitar. As entertainers go, Trump literally, had a team of people who made him look more successful than he was, and he'd walk into a room and say, you're fired or you're not fired, probably based on something somebody else told him to do. So, but just so many elements of the Bob Roberts character and the culture around the Bob Roberts character basically predicted Trump. So there's the conflation of entertainment and politics, and there's even, I have to say, a great kind of sideways indictment of Saturday Night Live and NBC, not Saturday Night Live in particular, but NBC, because in the movie, the Bob Roberts character appears on a sketch comedy show that isn't named Saturday Night Live, but it's clearly meant to be a Saturday Night Live type show. And, NBC was so complicit in Trump's campaign because The Apprentice had been an NBC show, and they have, by all accounts, hours of behind the scenes footage that would prove Trump to be totally incompetent as a president, and they kept it all under wraps and never asked the hard questions as a network. So that's an interesting aside. The celebration of greed and cruelty that Trump manifested, hopefully in the most extreme, worst way we've ever seen in this culture. I hope we don't go farther than that ever. The embrace of violence and vigilante conservative violence, the co-optation of pieces of culture that are usually expressions of liberal or left-leaning sentiment into the right. So Bob Roberts' character is a conservative folk singer who writes songs about, welfare mothers and lazy people who don't want to work and, God and the flag, right? But folk singing was traditionally a part of, the left counterculture movement. So that the way that right-wing politicians, but also the media in general, have just like eaten up whatever they want and spit out their own version of it over the years. And then also this like rebel, outsider, conservative energy that that Trump was somehow able to manipulate, even though he was a total wealthy insider, which is the Bob Roberts character. He's a highly successful businessman who's claiming to be a rebel outsider, and Trump was a weird, shady, pseudo-successful businessman who was claiming to be an outsider, caring about, the little guy, when he really represented the status quo. And then, of course, the big one being, the kind of use of racism. And here I will say that the Bob Roberts character is much more subtle than Trump was. Trump went way further in his use of race baiting as a way to bring white people around him and support him. And Bob Roberts was much more subtle. I mean, it's there, but he wasn't going a tenth as far as Trump went. But I mean, so many predictors of where right-wing culture went. And it's interesting because in interviews for the film in the early 90s, Tim Robbins talks about talking to Republicans who were very worried about the Republican Party then. So, which is an interesting thing to think about, because I knew the right was already moving further right then, and I knew that that was dragging the left to the center, but I didn't know that there were Republicans who were worried about the party then. So really interesting that these two films came out in the same year, where Tim Robbins plays different versions of, ruthlessly ambitious, cruel, self-oriented characters. Bob Roberts, a really interesting watch today, kind of horrifyingly mesmerizing in its prophetic nature. And Tim Robbins has said that he was hoping it wouldn't be prophetic. Interesting side note, Tim Robbins never released a soundtrack of all the songs because he never wanted them to be used by the right. But this is a film that is literally not streaming anywhere. It's hard to find the DVD. I own the DVD. I've owned it for a long time. But I'm sure through your library system, if you have a DVD player, you could get it through your library system for free. But this is part of why I'm highlighting Museum of the Moving Image tonight. Okay, there's so much more to say about this film. First of all, I want to say that Tim Robbins in recent interviews has just encouraged people to pirate the movie, like download it if you can find it somewhere. I think there are those clips on YouTube you can watch it. He's like, I have no financial interest in this anymore. Just watch the movie however you can watch the movie. So the writer, director, and star and producer is telling you, watch the movie however you can watch the movie, money be damned. We didn't even talk about the fact that Gore Vidal, one of the greatest American thinkers of the 20th century, is in this film playing a senator. And there's a section where Tim Robbins literally just points the camera at him and lets him talk about politics in our country. So there's that little gem of American political history in there. There's so much to say about this film, the integrity that went into making it. Please watch Bob Roberts. Also watch The Player, and think of them as a pair coming out in the same year. Very interesting confluence of influence, creativity, manifestation, just a fascinating moment when those two films came out in the same year. Thank you, Tim Robbins, for your life devoted to the film and theater arts, and happy birthday. I hope you like these films. If you've seen them, if you have thoughts about them, please comment below, hit like or subscribe, and I will see you next Wednesday. Thanks for watching Real Takes. Hit the subscribe button below so the algorithms will tell you when new episodes are out. And if you want to support Real Takes, please visit my Patreon page where you can join at any tier from $2 to $100 per thing I make. The $15 tier is specifically about supporting Real Takes, and you'll get behind the scenes information and be thanked in future videos. See you next Wednesday.